Good morning, everyone. We're here on a beautiful spring day. Of course, I can't tell I'm in the basement, but here it is. And I've collected quite a few things this week, this month, that I wanted to talk about. It's kind of my top five or top 10 ideas in the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years that I've collected and have done a lot of ruminating over, and that have in many ways been very helpful to me. And some of them will be familiar to you. Some of the themes will be familiar because they are my favorites. And these are my little nuggets that I that I like to roll around in my fingers as I'm thinking or taking a walk in the afternoons. I want to start. Much of this is coming out of the Christian Bible with a Vedantic twist to it all to help it align and make sense. Incidentally, I think that's one of the beautiful things about the Vedanta is that knowing these truths as outlined within the Vedas, you can approach any religion, and I find that the tangles of that religion come undone. That the Vedanta is sort of a philosophical comb that gives a cohesiveness and a unity to many of the world's religions, and I have found that to be a fascinating exercise to go in and look at the world's religions from that perspective and see that delightful oneness that becomes so obvious in it when you are a student of the Vedanta, that Sanatana Dharma, the religion of religion, the religion in all religions, and not manifested as any single religion. And that it's a wonderful exercise. So in that spirit, we're going to go over to the book of John. He was Jesus's favorite disciple historically, at least the one that is where it's recorded that Jesus loved him the most. And so they were very close, and you can see that in John's writings. He's very intimate about the Christ and very intimate with the philosophy and the teachings. He really embraces and gives it a warmth that I think you have to look a little bit harder elsewhere to find. So he takes us back to this very beginning. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind." One of my favorite verses, because there's so many hints in there for the nature of life, the nature of reality. Of course, in the beginning was the Word, this sound, this vibration, this activity that gave birth to this world, to the three gunas and their shaking, vibrating interrelationships with each other that has become all of the visible world that we see. And that this Word was God. So God is the isness that all things have come from, the great I am. And from that divinity, with the Word, all things have sprung into being. And the interesting thing here is it brings that interesting what do you call that perplexing angle here when it says that the Word was God and the Word was with God. So you've got that famous Vedantic idea of one without a second and yet seeming to be two. Or in the words of Ramana Maharshi, we have awareness and then the awareness of awareness. And so in that little place where the Word is with God, we have our visible world and the reality that we live in, where we see ourselves as separate from God. And yet, according to the Vedas, we have that relationship of oneness where we actually are the divine from a perspective or from an understanding or from an unspeakable place that we can't really put into words. So we see that we are, in fact, that divinity, and that we are the action of God's absoluteness, his stillness, his unchanging nature. And that in him was that life, in him was life, living, the experience of being, and that this life is the light of all mankind. So he is the original light, and we are the reflection of that. Very similar to how the Vedas talk about the light of the sun being reflected in the many pots. That here we are created in the image of God, and that light that reflects in us, that creates each one of us, that gives us our sense of being, is that original Word that is both God and with God. And so it says in Genesis 3 that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And so in this image of the beloved, in this reflection of that Satchit Ananda, we exist. We are. We are a reflection of that love. We are a reflection of that ultimate intelligence. We are a reflection of that I am, that being. And this nature that we reflect is infinite, infinite in every way, infinitely beautiful, infinitely terrifying, infinitely intimate, infinitely distant. It's all of these things together. And we experience all of that piecemeal while falling through it in a life, as if we're falling through the substance of God and experiencing all of those angles of possibility as we fall through Him with a particular perspective, a singular perspective of seeing, of touching, of tasting, of being. But He Himself, that divine Word, when it is God and not when it's with God, is that unchanging self, that unchanging original. And I mentioned in a vlog about a week ago the necessity of this and why it's necessary. That we live in a relative world. And the first meaning of that, the first deduction you can make from that, is nothing has a value in and of itself. In a relative world, all value is derived through relationship. And the ultimate relationship is you. Anything in the world has no value, positive or negative, until it meets you. And you then determine whether it is a good thing or a bad thing or a neutral thing as it affects you, as your perspective of self is. So with everything being determined by relationships with everything else, we have no way of knowing what is big or small. We have no way of knowing what is up or down, rich or poor, because if all of these things are in movement and all of them are relative to one another, there is no meaning into it. It collapses and becomes utterly meaningless. It collapses and becomes nothingness. And so you have to have that original perspective, that original post, as it were, the original pin in the map from which you will measure everything else. Without that one pin to begin a relative world, you have no relationships, you have no meaning. And that one pin can't be moving because it can't be relative. You see, it has to be an absolute. It has to be unchanging. It has to be stable, because if it's moving, then you can never tell how far anything is from anything else, because your point of reference is constantly on the move. And so that is at least one logical idea of why God is absolute, unchanging, the original pin in the map. That reality, that unchanging absolute reality from which everything in the relative world gains its value and thereby gains its existence, gains its relationship with the whole. And so God is that unchanging. And that beauty that lies in that is of the nature of God being pure love. You know, the Christians, at least in First John, they write it just straight out that God is love. Anybody who is not deeply familiar with love does not know God. So the nature of this universe is love. And one of the most beautiful things about that is that we can ruminate about that and fall in love with the divine. This is where devotion comes from, seeing God in all things, developing that relationship with all things as a relationship with the beloved, with the divine, so that we sit not only in relationship to the divine, but in the very lap of the divine, in an intimacy that only grows more and more precious and deep with each realization of exactly how intimate it is. To know that the divine is that part of you that has watched your thoughts all of this time, that you have named yourself, but was borrowed from your beloved. When you think of that closeness, that He feels your emotions, not as a third person, but as you. And He walks through your life, not as a third person observer, but as you, and knows your pain intimately, knows your struggles, knows your joys and your happinesses. He understands the tangle in which you live and survive and have your being. And the nature of that presence is love, unchanging, unconditioned, absolute, that gives the rest of your world meaning, that gives the rest of your world its relationship with you. And in that is a great deal of joy and a great huge number of reasons to get up and to keep going and to touch life and to experience your beloved in the way of the Word with God. That we know that this divinity in us is all knowing. It is intelligence itself. And how do we know that? Because we understand the idea of meaning. You see, if you look at your mind as being a big blackboard upon which all of the senses just kind of splatter information, just splatter meaningless information, zeros and ones, if you want to talk in computer technology, they get splattered on the wall of the mind. If the wall of the mind was not of the nature of intelligence, it would not make any sense out of the information from the senses. It would not have any understanding of the whole that the information betrays from the senses. It would just be noise. And they know this even scientifically, in the sense that you learned how to use your eyes. When you first opened your eyes, even though light became familiar to the mind, it did not know what it was seeing, did not have an understanding of that information, could not break it into people and animals and plants and objects and whatnot. And they found this out because they one time were able to restore the vision of a man that was born blind. And he got this barrage of light in his mind, but he couldn't distinguish anything. The mind had not been trained as to what to do with that information. And so he still couldn't see, still couldn't resolve all of that sensory information into meaning. See, that's the nature of mind. That's the nature of mind. It's presented with all of this meaningless information barraged on it by the senses. And from that, it produces a narrative, which is, in one sense, fortunate in that it's your vision of the divine, and one sense unfortunate in that it's incomplete, and therefore it's Maya. It becomes an interpretation special to you, an interpretation on facts that in their actuality are immeasurable, but by you are only able to be collected through the five senses. So highly restricted, highly limited in what you can know through the senses. And therein lies our danger. We have this awareness of ourself, this intimacy of the beloved, and it's something that we forget, and it's something that we have not properly digested. You see, when we live in a world of the senses, we're very limited in what we can know, very limited in what we can understand. Everything that we engage with through the world of the senses is transactional. So we get this idea of limit and restriction everywhere, constantly. And we take that limit and restriction and we apply it to our own sense of self. We make our immortality mortal. We make our infinity finite. And we try and exist within this small, limited, and restricted manifestation. And since we know of the world only through the senses, because that's where we're going to learn of it, which is an option, it's not the only way to do it. And that's what the scriptures are trying to give us a clue about. That if you want to know about where you are, what you are, who you are, and what this experience is, that you can ask the mind, and it will, in fact, provide you with a random piece of narrative to describe it to you. You can ask the body, and it also will give you a narrowly defined stream of information about who you are. But then the sages say, why ask who you are? What a crazy idea. You are what you are. Be what you are. And in that silence of non-asking, in that silence of acceptance and surrender within, you have another source of information that doesn't come in the same way that things are metered out to you through the senses. This comes in bursts of understanding, bursts of aha, it makes sense, intuitive knowledge. It's the source of faith. It is the way that your relationship with God in that actuality actually grows. It's through this inner experience that all of the words of Scripture are pointing at, that all of the happenings of your day are pointing at. And so that's why it's so terribly important important to remember that in this relative world, that one absolute is the divinity within you, whose nature is love, so that everything you touch, taste, smell, hear, and act in a day can be resolved through that knowledge into a proper seeing, into a proper understanding, so that you grow, so that you thrive, so that you become more of a fullness of your manifestation and not defined and limited by the misunderstanding, by the sources of information coming at you from the perceived outside. So this mind that we've kind of disturbed and created, this mind actually, which in my estimation was meant to be the satellite dish pointing at God, that the mind was never meant to be employed with story, with senses of me and mine, with an existence separate and apart from the whole. That's how we've employed it, and certainly it's possible to play a great game with that, and it gets quite delicious sometimes and quite annoying at other times. But that's not the nature of mind. The nature of mind is stillness. The nature of mind is receptive. What if it's not an organ of action? What if the mind was not meant to be used for figuring calculus or for considering futures and likes and dislikes? What if the mind was simply there to show you the reflection of the divinity of your beloved clearly and solely to you in the most intimate place of your being? That where God, the Word as God, manifests as the Word with God. That place at your very center where that distinction, ever so subtle, becomes the very point of your being and the most intimate of places, where pure love unconditioned, pure intelligence unconditioned, and the sense of being undisturbed all mingle in such a sweetness and in such a wholeness that thousands of scriptures have been written over tens of thousands of years to point you there, to get you curious, to get you wondering, and to wake up within you that taste for love, that taste for divinity, that taste for what you know to be true, but yet can't seem to find in the world of the swirling senses. So, how did this happen? I've shared this before, and I think it's one of the most beautiful ways of talking about it, probably because it's from my roots. The story of the Garden of Eden. This is how it happened, and it gives us a great clue for figuring out how to reverse this happening, how to undo this happening in a way. Because we have within us that divine nature, we have within us the Garden of Eden. Even now, it exists within you, and it is a place of perfect rest and a perfect peace, perfect harmony, a place where in the cool of the day you can walk with the beloved. You can converse with the beloved. Sages like Sri Ramakrishna, like Jesus, like Buddha, they all tell us of the intimacy of that inner life, that inner space, and the beauty of it. And so we have this garden. Well, why don't we experience this garden if we are in fact full of it? If it is in fact what and who we are, then why not? Why don't we enjoy it? Why can't we find it? Well, the story explains it to us. It starts with the serpent, of course, the manifestation of ego. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say that you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "No, we may eat from the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat the fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." So you see, the mind comes and tempts her, says to her, well, what is this distinction? What is this sense of other that this tree represents? This knowledge of good and evil. What is the knowledge of good and evil? The knowledge of good and evil is just another word for ego. You see, your ego is the knowledge of good and evil. Why? Because the ego has created a place that's separate and apart from the divine will, the divine being. And so its perspective is slightly different from the divine being. In the direction in which it's in alignment with the divine will, we see harmony, we see love, we see purity. But to the distinction, to the degree that it distinguishes itself from the divine will, the divine presence, from there we see misery and pain. We see our suffering, because actually it's against our own will, because we are that divine will. You see, and that's one of the most beautiful realizations in this journey, is when you come to a place that understands that the will of God and your deepest inmost will are one and the same, that you really didn't want all of the vice, that you really didn't want all of the things of the world, that you were in fact calling out to the beloved in everything that you reached for, that you were in fact calling out for the beloved in everything that you thought would give you what you needed in the sense world, in the world of mind, living in this mind that you've created. So this sense of ego, this sense of self, where you put up a fence around this space called me and decided that God began on the other side of that fence and I began on the inside of this fence. And then we sorted everything out accordingly. Oh, that's outside of me. This is inside of me. And from there, our story of being goes on with a bang. This story of our ego that's constantly vibrating, it is, after all, a reflection of the Word, a vibration of the Word as with God, experiencing God. So he says, so the body and mind and the curiosity of this otherness, this sense of an ego that would be independent, overcomes Eve. And the serpent goes on and says, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." You see, he lies to her. You will become like God. Now, how is the reflection of God not like God? How is it that Eve, who was created in the very image of God, could not be like God already? And yet this doubt persists, this sniggle he's put in her mind that says, there's something that you lack. You are not one. You are not whole. You are not of the beloved. You are independent. You're an ego self. You're separate and apart. And there's one thing that you lack to be like God, and that is the knowledge of good and evil. Now, it's interesting that there's this knowledge of good and evil, but there really is no good and evil, you see, because the knowledge of good and evil in itself is a lie. Because from the perspective of God, there is no evil. He is the only perspective in the universe from which there is no suffering and no evil. From every other perspective of ours, we're off center just a bit, so we're wobbly. We have a sense of evil. We have a sense of right and wrong, avidya and avidya. But for that realized soul who has reunited with that one perspective in the center of the garden, this beautiful existence of the divine, from there, all things are seen as they are, perfect in their place, perfect in their time, and as they should be. So she wants to be like God. She's going to take him up on his offer. Okay, I'm not like God. I'm lacking something. I don't know good from evil. I better go ahead and eat from the tree, the only tree that I was asked not to eat of, because I would die if I tasted it. So she's a gutsy woman. A rather gutsy woman. And she says, "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it." So you see the process here. Now, it's interesting because you see that the fall here, the idea of the knowledge of good and evil, where does it begin? Well, first of all, it begins with forgetfulness, forgetting that you are already divine, forgetting your nature, that you are already content, that you are already blissful, that you're already intelligent. Forgetting those things. That's step number one. He had to get Eve to forget her oneness with the divine, get her to doubt it, and get her to feel some sense of lack, some result of being finite, some result to being relative. So she steps into it. And how does she step into it? By going into the senses to look at the world. She looks at this fruit of the tree with her eyes, and she sees that it's good for food. Ooh, it will make me whole, right? It will fill me. It will give me satisfaction. So she looks and she projects the possibility of being fulfilled, of being made full, by this one thing. This is the fruit she needs to take care of that hunger. So she sees that it's good for food and it's pleasing to the eye. It's beautiful. So there's an attraction there. So she has stepped into the senses, forgetting her infinite nature, finds her solution through the senses by thinking this outside world contains the fruit that will make her whole, that will make her content, that will make her like God. And she runs toward the beautiful, those things that are reflecting divinity in themselves, not the whole of divinity, but a flash. She's going to gather those things up and to collect them, because she says that this was also desirable for gaining wisdom. This was how she was going to find out who she is. I'm going to go through my senses to find out what it is that I'm lacking, what it is that I am, what it is that will make me whole, and what it is that will make me like God, back to where I started again. So you see, the error here is this forgetfulness of our identity, and then running to the mind to ask the mind, who am I? What am I? And the mind runs to the body. Yes, tell us, who are we? What are we? And the mind gives you a description of itself, and it gives you a description of the body, but it never describes you, because there are no words for you. You are all the words. You are all the vibration. You are that word through which all was created, and nothing is created without it. So when you go, your world goes. You are the very center of that world, and it crushes when you are crushed, when you go out, when your light goes out and the senses collapse. So she says, she does it. She reaches for this fruit. She wants to know what it is to be like God. She wants to know what it is to be infinite. So she takes this fruit and she eats it. And lo and behold, she disturbs the mind for the first time. Lo and behold, for the first time, two fingers called me and mine have disturbed the calm lake of the mind, and God is no longer obvious. Oneness with God is no longer ready for assumption. That it now is clouded and difficult to see and confusing, because now the moon, which was once reflected whole in its wholeness in that lake, because of the fingers of me and mine, because of the forgetfulness of nature, because of the longing through the senses, now is a reflection of 1,000 shards of a whole moon, without any hint of its unity, of its order, and its oneness. So she has now defined herself as being limited. She's going now through her senses to define who she is, and she has become small. We see that the first thing that happens to them is that they realize they're naked. They've become vulnerable. As soon as you become one among many, suddenly there's danger, there's fear, because you don't know the other that you've now assumed. So fear is there. And so we find that later on in the chapter, when that God is walking through the Garden of Eden in the cool of the evening, and he calls out to his beloveds, to Adam and to Eve, "Where are you?" And they said, "Oh, we heard you coming, and we hid from you because we were naked." All right. Suddenly we hear the heart of God break. Because here his creation, his beautiful unity, his mastery of wonder has deluded itself, has separated itself from him, and has become afraid of him. Now, what does that imply? To be afraid of divine love. That's a forgetfulness. That's an unknowing. For God is that infinite love, and there is no harm in that infinite love. There is only refuge. There is only strength. There is only growth and wholeness. You see, and that's the first sign of our mistake. We fear God in the sense that we don't trust, in the sense that we don't believe, in the sense that we feel ashamed and we want to run and hide our vulnerability. hide our brokenness, hide our attachments, and to nurture our wounds by ourselves, as it were. But what a different story this would have become if the two of them had not hid from God, had not hidden from God, had not gone out through their senses, had perhaps eaten of the knowledge of good and evil, perhaps experienced that breaking of that relationship. But how different it would have been if they had sought him out, if they had gone running for God and said, "Oh my gosh, we've made this terrible mistake," and this, I don't know what happened. I don't know how I forgot. I don't know how I got here, but I don't want this. I want that unity. You know. But the problem with going through the senses is that we continue to go through the senses. They're intoxicating. They're hard to escape once we get stuck in their tendrils, those sticky notions of what is. And so Eve is the same. Eve has gotten stuck there. Adam has gotten stuck there. And so here they are running from their beloved, hiding because of their vulnerability, afraid of their condition, hungry for fulfillment. And we see that in what God says is the curse of the garden. And quite often we read this as being the punishment, that he somehow created a punishment and gave them a punishment. That can be looked at that way, no harm. But really what happened there is he just named the consequences of what happens when you think yourself separate and apart from the whole, when you think yourself small and finite, when you accept the fear and the definition of the body-mind as yourself. You will never be full again. You will always be hungry, because you're an infinite being who's trapped now, by his own accord, in limitation and restriction, by an ego that does not have any existence, whose very nature is hunger, who wants to be separate and apart from a whole that it cannot be separate and apart from. And so it will constantly look for wrong ideation in order to support that sense of self. That's what narcissism is. That's what egoism is. It's our collection of wrong ideas about what we are that are all sort of an intersupporting tangle of personality in which we are lost. But we think we have a gem. We think we have something beautiful. And so we clutch so tightly to our personality, so clutched in our bodies and our minds, afraid and looking for peace, but looking out, looking through the senses, through this model of limitation and restriction. So he tells them, you're going to scratch at the dust of the earth for all the days of your life in search of your desires. That condition that the whole world has accepted, that somehow we've been brought into this idea that the only way to survive is to go out there, get married, get a job, get an education, and start collecting houses and cars and children's and vacation time and sick days and experience, and move from one level of success to the next level of success, never thinking that there could be another way of doing this. What about a world where we all thought about each other? Nobody got up to go to work. Everybody got up in order to serve someone else. Everyone went outside to give. What an interesting place that would be. Of course, it's pie in the sky for us because we've defined ourselves very differently. But this is the point of religion. This is the point of spiritual life, that there does exist a different possibility, a Garden of Eden within you, and that you can return to this garden within you and find this infinite strength. And one by one, as each of us becomes the change that we want to see in the world, according to the words of Gandhi, we slowly approach this ideal state. Will it ever manifest as ideal? That's up to the beloved. That's not something we can know. But certainly we will come to a realization. And in that realization, we will drop our ego. We will give up on our senses and our body as being that which is going to define and teach us. And we return to that inner self, the receptacle of all wisdom, of all knowledge and all love. So we live in this mind. This ego is Is mind become prison? It's no longer reflecting God, it's now reflecting thousands of shards of possibility, and we wander into it with our two fingers, me and mine, looking, grabbing, trying to catch the moon in its shard of reflections, and not being able to do it. But it's important to understand that it is, in fact, a mind that we live in, and not a world. We've talked about this ad infinitum, this notion that there is no verifiable outside world. And actually, the realized sages have said that there is no interior and exterior. We live in a mind, and all that you see and experience is in your mind only. You blame them on senses that you think are bringing in information from the outside world, but there is no outside world. And all that you are using to make your decisions about the outside world are actually in your mind. That's where you're working with all of these things. And you can say, oh, but sound comes from the outside world. You have no idea where sound comes from. You say it comes from your ear. Well, your idea of your ear was built in your mind. Well, my ear listens to the outside world. No, you've decided that the ear was the source of sound, and you've created a symbol called an ear to explain where sound comes from, because you don't see it coming from yourself. So you see, you're dwelling in a mind, and you can sit on and think about that for quite some time and maybe even lose some sanity. It's quite an idea, but it's one that becomes truer the more that you think about it. And there's wonder in that. There's potential in that. Because if there's no outside world, we're not subject to it. We're not victims of it. We don't have to answer to it. So there's a bit of freedom to be understood, to be gained. That freedom, there's a certain amount of implied power, perhaps an enormous amount of power, if there is no other. That's one of the most beautiful things that Eckhart Tolle talks about in his realization experience, where he saw the light as love and understood the oneness of all things. One of the things that brought him to that was his depression. He wakes up in the middle of the night so utterly depressed, thinking, I can't possibly live with myself anymore. And he's in a contemplative state, and so that strikes him as rather odd. Who is this I that's living with an I that it can't live with anymore? Am I two people? What is this strangeness? You see, and here we go back to the very beginning there of our first verse. The Word is God, and the Word was with God. You see, and we experience that seeming duality even in ourselves. That's why the path of jnana is to go look for that which is looking. Go find out who's asking who you are within you. What is this singularity who's watching all of our thought and receiving all of our sensual information? Who is it? And what is it? And what is its nature? Is it two? When I think, who am I talking to? Isn't that an odd thing that the process of thinking is sitting there having a conversation with your mind? With who? Are there two in you? And once again, we come to another point of religion, to cure that broken idea of self, which has made two out of one. And so that you can find that all the ideal that you've been wrestling with, your conscience that you've been arguing with and fighting with your whole life, was actually you the whole time. The singular you, the wise you, the you that is not lost in the world of ego and senses. And your job is to find that you and to unite the two wives under the tree together. If you know that story that Ramakrishna talks about, the wives of dispassion and discrimination, I think it was. That you have to unite these and bring this sense of being two back into a unity. So there's no conversation within. That calm mind doesn't come from ignorance and dullness. It comes from completion. When there is only one within you, the mind no longer needs to create the idea of a second, which is the ego, the idea that is supported only by me and mine. So when that second you is given up and you withdraw your power from it and you claim freedom for it, then you exist within yourself as yourself. And the Garden of Eden begins to manifest again in its original understanding, in your experience of being. Now, it's quite wonderful because you still have this unchanging self that you can feel within you, that's implied in you. Anytime you move something, the unmoving part of you is implied. So move everything, and it's all pointing at a self that's within you, within a body that's not moving. And it's that first relative point that we talked about, that absolute, unmoving, unchanging self, from which you can perceive all of the change of the universe, right? So that inner self is constantly being pointed at by everything that moves and everything that changes. And that's why Ramakrishna tells you, he says, stop looking at the things that are changing. Stop being enamored of change and find that within yourself which is not changing. That self which has been riding along sharp as a razor, clear as the day, from the day you were born to the day you die, and was implied by everything that happened seemingly in your life. That was implied by every thought that you watched. All of the things that you observed were by necessity not yourself, because you were observing them. You were separate from them. And so returning to this original point, this I of all eyes, which is the center of the universe and from which all of the relative world finds its meaning, exists in the center of the heart, exists within you, in this Garden of Eden. So we stand at the edge of this mind, and we can continue to stir it with our fingers in me and mine, and to identify with an ego, or we can begin to remove ourselves from that intoxicating delusion, to become sober, which is actually a very difficult thing to approach, because you and I have been intoxicated by our senses from the day we were born. We love them. We love the sense of I as small. We love the excitement and the danger of being finite, of being needy. And so there's a story that we have to break within, a story that we have to let go, a story of I that we have to transcend. And this takes a great deal of faith. Now, what is faith? Quite often we think, oh, faith is believing something without any evidence for that something. Well, that'll take you through your teenage years, maybe. After that seems kind of a ridiculous notion. What is faith? One of the direct disciples of Swami Vivekananda says that faith is this intuitive knowing of an eternal relationship. It's what you brought into this world with you. That sense of I, which has been in you for your whole life, that has accepted the body as a description of itself from the beginning, even though that body has changed utterly since then. That unchanging I is your first and only gift. It is the real you, that unchanging nature of the universe, that absolute love. And so to be constantly aware of that through the implication of the life that you're living, not through the direct information of the senses, because the senses can't give you anything that's direct. They can only give you interpreted information. This inner space, the solitude of this inner unchanging self, gives you direct knowledge. It's not interpreted. It doesn't come through a mind. It doesn't come through a body. It comes through intuition, as it were, in a certain knowing. And I feel like the evidence for that are the two things that we know of this world, that we bring into this world, that we could not have learned from this world. And I mention them quite a few times because I find it very intriguing. The notion of immortality. Where could we have learned such an idea from? In this world, there is no example of immortality, nothing that hints at immortality. Everything has its cycle of life. And yet somehow we know profoundly this idea of immortality. That's faith, because that comes in with you. It is something you could not have learned from this world. It is part of you that you brought here. Faith is the willingness to accept that, the willingness to sit in that space. So we have our immortality. What's the other concept we should have no notion of? Infinity. There's nothing in this world that's infinite. Everything has its limits. Even space itself, they say, has its boundary, which always puzzled me. What would be on the other side of space? But there it is, that everything in this world is finite, and yet we have a very clear notion of infinity. Again, that's something you brought with you, something that's inherent in your nature. And faith is to accept that without proof, because there's no proof of it in this world, for either your immortality or your infinity. And so, if there's no proof, and yet you have somehow a very personal and very, very intimate knowledge of both of these concepts, the process of faith is learning to identify with them and to remove the fear of your smallness and to remove the fear of your ignorance and to return to an unknowable assumption that you are the one without a second, that you were not a part of anything, that you weren't broken into shards. It was only the reflected image that you broke when you identified with ego, that it wasn't you who broke, it was your ego that broke your understanding. So there's some fun that we can have with this notion of living in a mind that we're not defined by a world. We're not in a world that has power over us. We're in something very different. In Matthew 17, there's a wonderful little story. There's a few stories in a row I'm going to tell. Afterward, the disciples came to Jesus privately and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" Now, the story was that they were trying to drive an evil spirit out of some man suffering from apparently an evil spirit. And they weren't able to cure him. And they were curious, why couldn't we cure him? And Jesus said, because you have so little faith. You have so little faith. What is it to have a little faith? That means that you're still defining yourself by things that you do, by things that are changing, by this ego self, the thoughts of the mind, the conditions of the body. Why couldn't we drive it out? Because you have so little faith, he answered. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, that's a tiny little thing, as you know. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Okay. I dare you to sit and digest that little story right there. If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, if you have learned to establish your knowledge of yourself in that one unchanging being, surrender the ego to the divine will completely. If you can have this faith to believe and know that to be your nature and yourself, you can say to a mountain, move over there. And without hesitation, that mountain will move. Why? Because you live in a mind, and that mind is yours. The reason that it doesn't move is because of the very first reactions that you believe more when you hear me say that to you. We don't believe it at all. We can't assume it to be true at all. And that's why Jesus says, your faith is smaller than a mustard seed. You don't have any. You have to find this transcendent non-relation with yourself. This unmovable, unchangeable self within. A second story, he replied in Luke, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, okay? So he's hanging on to that. He's saying not very much, just a little bit of faith, but real faith, something you can stand on. You can say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. All right, so there's Jesus, telling you, you can tell this tree to uproot itself and plant itself somewhere else, and it will obey you. Why don't you believe that? Because you've gone to your senses for your definition of who you are, and your senses don't tell you that that's possible. Because you've gone to your mind to find out who you are, and that mind has lied to you about being small and separate and independent from the whole, that the whole is not you. And this knowledge of good and evil, that is what makes you like God. You see, that's the lie that robbed you of your mustard seed. That is the lie that you have believed and continue to feed by continually going to the mind and body for your definition of what you are, by finding your pleasures in the vibrations of all of its different states and conditions. In the book of Mark, Jesus gets even more direct. He says, "Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." All right, 3 times. And there's many more examples of this also, not just in Christian scriptures, these are the ones I'm familiar with, but in all the world scriptures where God makes these claims. Where are the believers? Where are those of us who can let go of this mustard seed of lies about our nature, about what we are, about who we are, about what is and what is the nature of this reality? Where are the ones willing to let go and to just, in the smallest amount possible, believe in their infinite immortal self? In that small, small faith of a mustard seed, to believe that you are the love of the universe, that you are the intelligence that makes this all swirl and appear and disappear, that you are the amness around which it swirls. You are the heart of the universe, that it exists within you. Let go of this knowledge of good and evil, of vidya and avidya. Let go of this idea of positive and negative, of duality, and find this oneness. Breathe in the love of the divine, and know that with every breath that you inhale, God creates you new. Each moment, with infinite potential. Take back your power. Take back your knowledge. Take back that idea of self as infinite and immortal and full of love. Buy into that intimacy with the divine. Fall into the lap of the mother. Embrace the heart of your beloved and be cured. In John 17, Jesus makes his final prayer the night before he's crucified. His final prayer to the world. I have given them the glory you gave me. He's talking about us. He's given us the glory of our nature, the freedom to return home. I have given them the glory you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one, that they may know of this wholeness within themselves. In them and you in me, I in them and you in me, that they may be perfectly united, that we will surrender every shred of mind and ego that is separate from the divine will, that takes into any account of a me and mine, that eliminates any account of a me and mine from the body and mind, that we surrender that, we lay it down, and become perfectly united with the heart and mind of the beloved, that the will of the universe and our will of the moment is inexplicably one, and the universe is because of it, in utter obedience, in utter unity, in absolute singularity, one without a second, so that the world may know that you sent me and have loved them just as you have loved me. Is there any question that God loves the avatar? That a Holy Mother, or a Ramakrishna, or a Buddha, or a Rama, or a Krishna, or Chaitanya, or a Jesus, that God's love for you is the same as his love for them, as it were, within our story. Will you believe that? Will you find in that the strength to let go, to take a chance, to fall backwards into the infinite beloved, and to become what has been described as your birthright, that infinite, unchangeable, singular love and intelligence that has shared its existence with everything?